Thank you, Mr. Chair. Unlike any other agency, CFPB's funding is protected by several layers of insulation, which was discussed a couple times here today. And as we know, CFPB directors required only to submit a letter to the Federal Reserve Board each quarter certifying the amount of funds that are reasonably necessary. We've had Jay Powell before the committee, sitting right where you are, and was asked the question specifically about the CFPB and what did he think about the funding and how did it work? And his answer was, they send us a bill and we pay it. The Federal Reserve, which itself is funded outside the appropriations process, has been discussed, through assessments on Federal Reserve banks, which are in turn largely funded by open market operations and not through appropriations process, as you know, then transfers the requested amount, which is capped at 12%. I would have loved to have been in the room when somebody sitting at the table dreaming this up said 12% of the Fed's total operating expenses is a good number. No rhyme or reason to it. By requiring Congress to appropriate funds before they can be used by the executive, the Constitution requires Congress to act first before the government can do anything. The current funding structure of the Bureau impermissibly reverses the process, right? It makes no sense. And by contrast, a handful of other agencies that are funded outside the typical appropriations process, like the FDIC and what's been discussed, NCUA, FHFA, they'll obtain their funding by assessing fees against what otherwise would be considered regulated entities, right? So there's a difference. But in each instance, the other financial regulators receive funding directly from regulated entities as authorized by statute. None of these agencies enjoy the perpetual funding mechanism, which funds drawn from another agency, let alone one with another layer of budgetary independence. So the Trump administration proposed limiting CFPB's mandatory funding in 2020 before providing discretionary appropriations in 2021. These changes were projected to provide over $5 billion in savings over 10 years. Mr. Johnson, can you elaborate on what sets the CFPB apart from other agencies in terms of accountability and discuss the increased accountability that could come from moving the CFPB to the congressional appropriations? I understand there's somewhat of a redundancy. This question has kind of been asked in many different forms, but if you could just once again take a crack at it.
Certainly, Congressman. So I think one key consideration for Congress to make is when agencies have siloed budgets, they don't make reasoned judgments about relative spending priorities for the U.S. government as a whole. That's a job that Congress has. And so when the agency goes through its own budget process, particularly if there's no congressional oversight, if there's no other external checks and balances, invariably the lack of oversight incentivizes loose spending and skews priorities. So the accountability that would come from congressional appropriations would be the collective judgment of Congress as a whole as to what the United States government's spending priorities should be and where the CFPB's funding fits within those relative priorities.
Mr. White, let me ask you, we've had Director Chopra before the committee numerous times as well. And the one thing that he's never able to, I think, address directly is, are there any reliable metrics available to evaluate the effectiveness of the CFPB in enforcing the federal consumer laws? And if so, can you please provide an example? But he's unable to answer this because really the way they measure success is to just kind of roll out data that says, here's how many contacts, here's how many phone calls we got. Well, if a member of Congress based their success as an elected official on how many phone calls come into the office, we'd be out of office soon. So can you just, once again, are there any real measurable, effective ways of saying, okay, the CFPB is doing a good job?
There have been efforts over 40 years to use tools like cost-benefit analysis to show the effectiveness of an agency's rulemaking actions, both the benefits but also the costs, both of which are important. But I think that your question illustrates the fact that especially in this area, in this agency, there's been a real paucity of metrics and a paucity of a commitment to finding metrics.
Thank you. I yield back.